Well, it's overdue that Canada stop funding fossil fuels overseas, but it really makes it rather obvious. Why are we not pledging to stop funding fossil fuels at home? Expansion of fossil fuel enterprise, building the Trans Mountain Pipeline, approving offshore oil developments, subsidizing fracking should be stopped within Canada. And at the same time, absolutely, we should stop funding fossil fuel development overseas. And it means the Export Development Corporation, which is the number one source of our fossil fuel subsidies, should divest from fossil fuel investments and stop subsidizing fossil fuels. I agree with that. We don't, and it's something like, Mark Carney's $130 trillion capital flows is mind-boggling, but it's also somewhat opaque. How does that work? How are we accessing those? We know that the financing world will decide for itself what that means, again, with a target of net zero by 2050, instead of the real target, which is we must not allow the planetary warming global average temperature increase to go above 1.5 degrees if we're going to have any kind of reasonable prospect for hanging on to human civilization. And it's really important for people to remember that the IPCC report in October 2018 said we would blow by 1.5 before 2030 without aggressive and immediate and urgent action. And that was more than 2 years ago. It's 3 years ago. 3 years ago. And we have not taken aggressive, immediate action. So we can't keep pretending we have enough time to make incremental change. And we also have to recognize that the investments and the subsidies that governments, particularly Canada with the worst record, are making in propping up fossil fuels are holding back a revolution of renewables, which is, the disruptive technology, that the impact of solar being cheaper than coal is an enormous impact. So what is Canada doing? By subsidizing fossil fuels, that's the only money going to fossil fuels is from the public purse, because the smart money's moving away. Well, I remember when Harper was Prime Minister, because I fought this at the time, a coal-fired power plant in South Africa, and it was in the business pages of the Globe and Mail how awful it was that we weren't getting it built, because there was a Canadian investor that wanted to get this coal-fired. We actually used public funds to help build a coal plant in South Africa within the last, it was obviously more than 6 years ago, but less than 10, so we're about 8 years ago. Peter Van Loan, at the time, as a Conservative Party activist within the Conservative caucus, was pushing hard for why has this not gone ahead. So some of our money to fossil fuel projects actually flows through CEDA, which we used to have CEDA, but our international development funds. Some of it flows through decisions made by Export Development Canada. They're generally, why would Canada subsidize fossil fuels in other countries? Because a Canadian corporation is involved at some point, and we're actually, the banner headline is that we're supporting Canadian investments. Canadian corporations benefit from this. And if you go back through our international development flows of funds for decades, often find that there's a Canadian engineering company hired to do the feasibility studies, whatever. So the funding that's allegedly for the poorest of the poor quite often is subverted with another agenda to make sure it's helping a Canadian corporation. But through a number of different channels, Canadian public funds go to fossil fuel projects overseas, but a fraction of what goes to fossil fuel projects within Canada. Engineering companies, the whole gamut. Pipeline servicing companies. When a Canadian corporation is making the case that they've got we don't do a lot of thermal coal these days, but that's been one in the past. So you're looking at a range of technological investment. You're looking at, one of the worst projects being proposed anywhere in the world right now is a Canadian company in Vancouver, Recon Africa, that wants to develop in the Avanca Delta, and it's in Namibia, but with real impacts next door, where there's a world biosphere reserve. So there's a range of Canadian interests in things that Canadians would rather not be. We don't want to stitch the Canadian flag on our backpack because we're so proud of our mining companies overseas, right? And in the Indigenous people of the area have been raising concerns. It's a very, I think it's one of those projects that may turn out to have been an effort to get paid off to go away. This is like saying, oh, we've just found some oil in the Sistine Chapel. Looks good. Let's just frack. I mean, it's on that order of incredibly important to global biodiversity that this area not be destroyed. Yeah, I introduced a petition in Parliament about it. I've been working on it quite a lot with people on the ground, and I tried to get a complaint before the new ombudsman for responsible enterprise, and they weren't set up yet to accept complaints, so I actually sent a letter. Anyway, it's a longer story, but I've been working on Recon Africa quite a bit. I'd like to find that out myself. I'm trying to work on it, but raising it in Parliament a few times now, just because of the thought of a Vancouver-based company. And it looks like pretty much, well, we're getting right into it, but it looks like pretty much a junior. Yeah. And what's it up to? But it boosts their share price. Yeah. The speculation around it, the idea that they might have access, because the way in which, and this has happened to us, certainly in Canada as well, when you're dealing with a junior, we fought for years to protect the Gulf of St. Lawrence from a company called Corridor Resources. They still have permits to develop something that they call the Old Harry site, which would be like, if it goes bad, it would be like the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, it's a deep water oil well in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It should never have been approved. But as soon as they have access to, on the books, this asset, that makes their shareholders' value go up, when it should really be like, okay, we've got stranded assets here. Let's get out from under this before, it's right now, investments in fossil fuels anywhere in the world are like a game of musical chairs. And that's why most of the big oil and gas companies, the big oil companies from around the world have pulled out of the oil sands, because that's a place where the chairs are going to be pulled fast, because it's very heavily carbon intensive, and it has inherently low value in the marketplace because it's a solid. So the fact that we're still, back to what we do on fossil fuels in Canada, the fact that we have federal first buying the pipeline and then creating a Crown Corporation to build it, Trans Mountain Pipeline, and the Crown Corporation that's building it should be absolutely pull the plug on that right away. It's a money loser. It makes no sense. But right now, the only money going into fossil fuels for new infrastructure is coming from government. But I mean, Statoil pulled out, Royal Dutch Shell pulled out, ConocoPhillips pulled out, Total SA pulled out. These are large oil and gas oil companies that used to be invested in the Alberta oil sands. They left. They left saying, we don't want stranded assets. We don't want unburnable carbon. But the Canadian business press covers these developments as, oh, great opportunity for more Canadian ownership of our oil sands. I mean, the extent to which our mainstream media is invested in defending fossil fuels, it would, if the average Canadian would be absolutely scandalized by the media bias in favor of fossil fuels in this country. As long as consistent with 1.5 degrees is understood through the IPCC information, Canada's government has conflated holding to 1.5 with net zero by 2050, which is a misreading, if not a deliberate corruption of IPCC advice. The IPCC made it clear in their special report on 1.5 degrees in October 2018 that there was only one pathway that holds to 1.5, which starts with 45% reductions in CO2 against 2010 levels by 2030. Then the window on 1.5 is closed before 2030, and it doesn't open again. So net zero by 2050 does not, and I can't repeat, capital NOT, underlined and in neon lights. Net zero by 2050 does not guarantee 1.5 degrees unless most of the work has been done before 2030. So by tweaking that to, which is what Bill C-12 that we just passed, but of course it's the Climate Accountability Act. What's it called? The Net Zero Climate Accountability Act. And the other parties except for the Bloc Québécois, rejected all my amendments whenever I tried to insert in the legislation that the goal is 1.5 degrees, avoiding going above 1.5 degrees. The goal is not net zero by 2050. So it's really good that the pledge that was just signed onto is talking about 1.5 as what must be protected, not this, Greta Thunberg wrote, the open letter from Climate Youth of Europe wrote to the European Commission 6 months ago. Net zero by 2050 is surrender. But that's, I think it's clearly where Environment Canada, climate change has directed I'm not sure whether it's a political spin that the bureaucracy is accepting. Believe it or not, I actually think this is more a bureaucratic spin, and I don't know how much the elected people realize that this is a perversion of IPCC advice. But it very clearly is a perversion of IPCC advice to put the emphasis on what can occur by 2050, and also on a net basis, which means they can fantasize new machinery that's going to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, or that carbon capture and storage is somehow going to become something that works at a cost that's affordable versus what makes sense, which is shutting down the industry as quickly as possible with protection for workers and allowing the rapid uptake of renewable energy to replace fossil fuels. No, not really. I know that the advisory board has just signed an MOU with the Institute for Climate Choices, which is I'm really pleased about this, because one of my big critiques of what was wrong with the Climate Accountability Act, besides everything else I just mentioned, is unlike the UK legislation, which of course every other country in the world that passed climate accountability legislation had their first milestone year within 5 years, right? So the UK passed climate accountability in 2008, and their first milestone year was 2013. The New Zealand passed it in 2020, first milestone year 2025. France, the same, everyone within 5 years. The other thing that deviates from what all the other sort of best practices around climate accountability legislation that our law did was not have an independent, well-funded, well-resourced expert group set up. So a multi-stakeholder committee appointed by the Minister of Environment, reporting to the Minister of Environment, is not the equivalent of what other countries have done. But this MOU with the Institute for Climate Choices at least creates the potential for some kind of depth for policy analysis, for number crunching, and for figuring out what's our carbon budget. That's another big problem, of course. The Climate Accountability Act does not include a carbon budget. My efforts to get carbon budgeting into the Act, like all my amendments, failed. But that was, Anyway, we need a carbon budget, and it should be determined by scientists. It's really not a multi-sectorial consensus process to say how much can the oil and gas industry accept. You need to start with, okay, we have a dwindling carbon budget. We absolutely know that we can't continue to use fossil fuels and produce fossil fuels at the scale we're now doing it. So what is that budget? What are those numbers? How do we hold to them? Start with the science, not the other way around. Yeah, hydrogen is not so much people need to grasp that hydrogen isn't a new source of energy. Hydrogen is just a way of transporting, conveying energy. So you can make hydrogen from burning coal. You can make hydrogen from wind turbines. You can get hydrogen from any other source of deriving energy. So Canada's strategy on hydrogen is not green hydrogen. It's a very dark hydrogen that does not pass the sniff test for does this help us hold to 1.5 degrees. It's as nonsensical as let's build the pipeline and the profits from the pipeline will fund a transition. It's exactly what Bill McKibben says when he says if you're trying to have a strategy to stop lung cancer, let's start by selling more cigarettes, and we can take the money from that to help people deal with lung cancer. I mean, it is not any way to defend. It's a pretzel argument. You really have to tie yourself up into knots to believe it. Canada was in the lead for quite a while because of Ballard fuel cells. And there's no question that the fuel cells initially, and I remember back to the Globe conference in gosh, Paul Martin was Prime Minister, so how long ago would that Globe conference have been? Sometime around 2004, perhaps. We were going to build a hydrogen highway to Whistler. We were really big on Ballard fuel cells, and fuel cells were seen as a way of replacing the internal combustion engine. I think with time, we're now seeing hydrogen and fuel cells as probably being more efficient for replacing power to buildings, to neighborhoods, more stationary facilities. So, and I wouldn't rule out that fuel cells come back as competitive with electric vehicles. I mean, the internal combustion engines days are done. That's happening. The market forces are driving us that way. But we need more hydrogen, but it has to be green. And we need to think about how do fuel cells work in the low-carbon economy. We've still got a foothold there through Canadian technology because of Ballard and because of being early adopters.